All right, so one of the slide decks linked at the beginning that's marked Spectre has all the slides from earlier, and then has this big red slide in the middle called Friday Lecture Stopped Here, and then after that we have new slides for Monday. I have more slides today because I spent a lot of time going through Spectre based on what I'm learning. All of my slide decks are based on a lot of back and forth with students. They're intended to really target the things you don't understand, and when I don't understand what you don't understand, it's really hard to make slides. When I start understanding what you're horrendously confused about, getting slides written is much easier. So, just triple checking that we're recording. And, yep, okay, good. I'm now permanently convinced that the audio is going to break in this room. All right, so on Friday, turning the lights down. I showed you that CPUs care about speed. They want fast, fast, fast. They do not want to wait. If a value is needed for a branch, as in an if statement, but it doesn't have to be an if statement, it could be a while statement or really anything that branches, then the CPU will speculatively execute, and it will pick the most likely branch based on its experience. It will not always pick true. I know we showed true most often on the board, but it will not always pick that. I got a lot of questions about why would it bother to do this. I'm certain that getting memory from RAM is fast. I did some searches on this, and the short answer is that the CPU can execute somewhere between 100 and 500 instructions while it's waiting for RAM. Depends a lot on your architecture, but the answer is it's not executing 2 instructions. It's executing on the order of hundreds. So actually, speculative execution is very valuable from the CPU because if it can be right often enough, it speeds it up a lot. And the key reason that Spectre is not currently fixed across, you can fix it, it's just, if you do, you slow your CPU down so badly. There's no way to fix this without horrendously slowing down the CPU because you suddenly have to wait 500 instructions while you get something from RAM. All right, an attacker process has the ability, and some of the things on the right are other attacks and other research papers, but it is possible for them to do these things. They may have to break some rules to do them, but we know they are still possible now, and it's unfixable as well. Clear the cache. The most simple solution to clearing the cache is just load something really big into the cache. Then what happens? It overwrites everything else in the cache, and you have cleared the cache. So they can clear the cache, or at least make certain values are not in it. And they're able to use a timing attack, and I'm not going to get into how they do that, but it is possible. They're able to tell whether or not a value is loading quickly or slowly. They cannot directly read memory that has no legit access to. This point, I think I was answering in a bit fuzzy on Friday, and so I doubled down on looking up how this works again, which I did know, but I hadn't had any to know for last year. It is simply impossible, and we will assume that for this attack. I'm certain you could find examples in Unix security where they have pulled it off, but it is unnecessary for Spectre. So even if we figured this out, it wouldn't fix it. And direct access to cache values is beyond, it cannot directly access cache values beyond its legitimate access rights. I think I said this incorrectly to someone, at least on Friday. It is only able to access things it's legitimately allowed to access. This is the other reason we can't fix Spectre. Memory addresses are loaded from slower to faster memory when they are needed. The faster memory, we don't have much of it. The slower memory, we have a lot more space. So it's always the case that when it's needed, it is loaded from, oh goodness. I test this in my office, I swear, and it works just fine. It goes from slower to faster, and it's always copying it in that direction. We don't care about writes for this attack, so I'm not really talking about them, but writing does go backwards if you care. And we only load this stuff when it's needed. All right, now we're going to talk about this if statement, the one I had sitting there on the slide tentatively at you all last time. The main concept of Spectre is that there are 2 processes running here. One of them is the attacker process, the other one's the victim process. The victim process is usually something with higher ability than the attacker. The kernel does a lot for you. You ask the kernel, will you please read this value off of Bluetooth? Could you please go in and access this file? Could you tell me if this file even exists? There's a lot of calls you make out to the kernel, don't you? And so this assumes that something like the kernel, and kernel is the most common target, is being accessed. And it assumes that whatever you're accessing in the victim has this feature. It needs two components. One, it needs to have a check in it. This is normal. Normally the kernel, if it's doing things right, is always doing things like checking the boundary of an array length. So it's really easy to find an if statement somewhere. And then after that, you need, this is a bit complicated, but you need something closer to this, where you have a value and then you have an array index. So you need an array somewhere that is going to take your value you gave to the function and use it as the index. Now, normally this is safe, right? It's totally safe because there's an if statement up here. And the if statement says only use this index if it's within the array value. And then it goes and takes this, and it takes the array, and it uses the attacker-provided index into the array. Normally safe because we check the bounds first, and something that has to happen a lot under normal conditions. Because you might say, oh, well, I need to get peripheral 4. Here's the number I want. I need this file at this position. There's so many reasons you need to do this. I will come back to array 2. Array 2 is definitely needed, but it doesn't technically have to be in the victim code. So this is the minimal amount you need from victim code. This is the ideal for victim code. All right, so for the next several slides, I have broken things into attacker code and victim code and who's doing what. So we're going to start with the attacker code. I've just put the if statement over on the side just for your reference, but we'll get back to that. So the attacker code, yep.
Go back one slide. What makes that ideal is, that's the minimum working example, but what makes
So the minimum working example, this is only inside of victim code. Outside of victim code, so after it calls it, it would need to do this in attacker code. So this line is, everything here must exist. It's just, this is the minimum for inside of the victim's code, and then the attacker would have to add this array access. But the attacker can do whatever the heck they feel like. So you'll that step through it. So the first thing the attacker has to do is, remember I keep saying it only executes in the direction it thinks is likely to happen. So the first thing the attacker does is access the victim function a lot with totally benign values. So it calls that array many, many times with something that is within limits. And because it does that, the processor now thinks to themselves, oh, this branch here always goes to true. Because it's gone to true the last 100 times. All right. Then it flushes values. So it performs an attack that removes from the cache the value used in the branch. So array 1 size in our code example. We need to make sure it's not in cache anymore. And the probe buffer, array 2, needs to not be in cache. The simplest solution is to just clear all of cache, but these two need to be gone. Then we load a secret. So we get the victim to load a secret into memory. The victim in this sentence means, say, the kernel. It doesn't necessarily need to be the same process, but it needs to be something that process can access. The kernel is the most likely thing to attack because it has access to everything. But for example, I might request that something be cryptographically signed. What will this do? This will force the private key to be loaded into cache, and it will persist in cache because while I might move the message in and out, I need the private key the whole length of that computation. All right. Then the attacker calls the victim function with bad input. By bad input, I mean an array out of bounds. So they will send a message that has something that's past the end of that array. This technically is now creating a buffer overread in the victim. Or it would. Okay, so it can't normally produce an overread because this X is guaranteed to be below array size. So if I send an X that's too big, this if should fail. But we're under speculative execution, and we know for certain an array size is not loaded in cache. So we have 200 instructions worth of runtime here before the processor figures this out. And so it is entirely possible for us to take array 1 and dump in a value that's too big for it. Now we're in a buffer overread. And now I can read everything after this point in memory, particularly in cache. Okay, so that was the speculative execution. Because array 1 size is not in the cache, the processor guesses from past experiences. It will always guess true because we set that up. We now do a buffer overread. The access level, the victim's access level evaluates array 1x, which read past the end of the buffer, but still within the victim memory. So it can't actually read past the end of what the victim has access to. But if the victim's the kernel, well, it's a lot of access. Next, we probe array access. This is the tricky part. So I'm going to pause here. Everyone's with me through the end of this slide. Okay, what we have now done is we have executed array 1. We have not done array 2. Array 2 is where a lot of the trick's sitting. So now what happens is array 2 is something that is owned or at least visible to the attacker. Maybe they passed it in, maybe it's in a shared position, it doesn't matter, but it needs to be something that the attacker is able to legitimately access normally, at least in read. The output of array 1, and I'm going to ignore this number here for half a second, is used as an index into array 2. What will happen if I try to write something to array 2? What's going to happen to the cache? It doesn't matter. There's only one cache on the computer. If I try to write something into the cache, that counts as an access, the same way read does, and it's going to load it. So now we don't always load full arrays into the cache. We load whatever part we need. So if you have a horrendously huge array, it will only load the index value it needs into cache. This is where the 4096 comes into impact, because that's 1 megabyte. That is roughly the size of 1 page. The computer is most likely to try and load things either 1 page or 1 cache line at a time. So by multiplying by that number, by the way, this attack is still possible without that number. It just gets less clean. If you load that number, now you've loaded basically 1 array index as 1 page, and you're guaranteed to load just that page and not a neighboring page. All right. This probe array access. This assumes, and we also basically treat that array index as 1 byte in size to access that size of memory. Then we cache load. So the processor initiates. This is not the victim is not doing this, but just the computer does this. It will initiate a load of array 2, which is now indexed effectively on secret value that was previously hidden. Speculative execution finally gets around to failing, and that means that array 1 size comes back. We discover this is false, and so the processor reverts all the state back to pre-speculation. It moves its pointer back up where it's executing. It clears all the registers. It doesn't touch the cache. Now, the attacker cannot directly access memory values that are assigned to the victim. So it can't, even though the victim has loaded the secret into cache, it's still protected. It's not the case that the attacker can directly access that. The victim just finishes normal execution because, well, we fixed our branch speculation. Everything's been rolled back. It just completes what it does, and it hands execution back over to the attacker. The attacker now loops through array 2. It just checks every value of array 2 until it finds one that comes back fast. When it comes back fast, what's the value of secret? It's the index divided by 4096 of array 2. All right, is everyone still here? I didn't come up with a think, pair, share, but I kind of want to release you to talk to your neighbor for about a minute and figure out how confused we are, because this is the attack. That's it. I don't really have slides past this point. So I'm just going to give us a 1 minute to chat with our neighbors to make sure we've understood what's going on here. All right. Okay, sudden massive shift sideways. Spectre is an example of how we can do a deep dive in and cause things. One thing you may have noticed from both buffer overflow and Spectre is, oh wow, it's really hard to spot this stuff and it's really hard to stop it from happening. And if you start creating unit tests against every possible thing out there, you're going to start going insane. Now, we're partially solving this with AI now. We just tell the AI, go create unit tests against every single possible thing out there. And admittedly, most of the things out there are much easier to detect than what we just went through. But the other solution is what we call fuzz testing. So this is a method. How many people have ever heard of fuzz testing? Couple. Okay, more than I was expecting, but not that many. Most of you have probably heard of unit testing. Unit testing is a lot more regulated. You have to sit there in advance and think about what you're going to do. Fuzz testing is, let's just throw random junk at the computer and see if anything goes wrong. Generally speaking, when we talk about testing, we have three types. We have white box testing. That means you have access to the code. You know exactly what's going on inside of there. If you're doing white box testing against hardware, you have a schematic, for example. You have a lot of access. You may even be able to go talk to the programmers. Now, ideally, all of our stuff would be secure even against white box testing, but not always. We also have black box testing. That means here's the input, and that's it. We don't really know anything beyond maybe what's in the API. And maybe we don't even have documentation for the API. Maybe we don't even have the API. We most definitely do not have access, though, to any code type code. We do not have access to detailed documentation of what's in the code. Maybe we have access to an API if we're lucky. Maybe we even know what kind of inputs a Type-C is expecting, a USB. And then there's gray box. This means that we have partial information. So maybe we know what algorithm was used, but we don't have access to the code. Maybe we have a very detailed API with good instructions, but again, we don't know what's actually in there. These are, broadly speaking, the types of testing we're usually working with. In normal testing, we plan. We take the specification. We go, okay, does it actually match the specification? This is what a traditional test engineer would do. It's thoughtful, planned, and usually a skilled test engineer will think about things like out-of-bound inputs. Though that requires the specification to state what is and is not in bounds. Fuzz testing, we generate semi-valid random input. So we just hook a random number generator up to it. We need some detailed knowledge. We don't really need to know detailed what's in the specification, but we do need to know where we're going to send that data. So we do need enough of an API to know what function calls maybe to call against, or if we don't, we need a list of common function calls that the system's going to just randomly try. This is traditionally considered black box testing, and the goal is to find situations that crash the program or otherwise cause instability. Ideally, we find input that crosses the trust boundary. So we want to find something that, based on the crash log, looks like the kernel did it, or something where the memory just kind of went in too much. If you're using fuzz testing at a rough level, then what you do is you hook up a fuzz tester, you hit go, you find everything that crashed the program, and then you start looking there. Fuzz testing is an excellent start and a terrible end. I think Consumer Reports also is used a lot in Canada. There's a magazine called Consumer Reports. It'll compare like this washing machine against that washing machine and tell you should buy this washing machine. About maybe 10 years, ago, Consumer Reports decided to start including security testing. But they didn't know how to do security testing. And so they put a call out to researchers. And one of the outcomes of that is now they sometimes fuzz test different components. Because it's really easy to fuzz test. You plug the thing in, there's a bunch of automated fuzz testers you can use, and then you can use that to go and determine whether or not your system crashes. Consumer Reports is not security engineers, so generally if things crash a lot, they just write a bad report and don't follow it up. But security engineers may do something different. This is what slide I meant to say this on. They do this a lot on things like baby monitors and smart scales and all of this weird stuff. Why would we want to use why would we want to do this? So I'm going to pick on cars for a moment because Volkswagen really mucked up at a certain point and it's well documented. When we're doing car safety tests, usually the test design is well agreed up front. So we state, okay, these are the tests. These are going to be done on this vehicle. The vehicle that's sent is usually tested a lot by the company using those exact same tests before it's sent to the car manufacturer. Things like fuzz testing is nice because you can both describe what it is you're doing and also not give the test to the person. But Volkswagen decided to create what's called a defeat device. This means that it tested whether or not it was in test conditions. And if it is in test conditions, it behaves differently than if it's not in test conditions. And this was found by a random researcher who checked out a Volkswagen car and was trying to do, I think, mileage per gallon or something measurements, and was finding stuff that did not match at all what they found under test. And then this went back and this got blown up a lot. So there's a whole discussion of how this happened. Because, let's see. Yeah, okay, so it was the emission control system. I believe fuzz testing also found heartbleed. So heartbleed's the one where you send a message in, you say 4 characters, and then it sends something back. Someone was fuzz testing this. A fuzz tester will very happily send 4 characters and say 27 because it's generating random output. And then it got output back it was not expecting. So Google and Codemonicon both use fuzz testing and found what's now known as heartbleed. All right. I throw that in there just because it's kind of a fun extra thing we do with computer security. You don't actually have to test things one way. There's a lot of ways to test things. And this is one of the ways we find things that are kind of out of bounds or weren't part of the specification or get the computer itself to push the boundaries. I am curious what will happen to fuzz testing in the age of AI. It has not yet replaced it, but we're going to find out. All right, so what's going to happen is I'm going to go through the remaining slides, and wherever we stop, we stop. And I will drop a slide in there to mark that point, and we will not be examining the rest of the slide deck if that happens. This slide deck is a combination of a history of malware, viruses, Trojans, all of that stuff, a definition of malware, viruses, Trojans, and all of that stuff. And what I partially want to get out of this is I don't want anyone walking out sounding like an idiot and not knowing what Morris worm and things are. When you've taken a security class. And also I want you to know the difference between a malware, virus, worm, Trojan, all of these words. Here's all the different types of attacks. There's so many types of attacks. These are common attacks. These are the ones we're talking about here. So there's a virus. Virus relies on someone or something else to propagate. So viruses are not self-propagating. You have to send an email, for example, that the virus attaches to. You have to move a USB drive that the virus attaches to. Worm is self-propagating. This thing will crawl across the entire internet in seconds, and in fact, everybody. It does not require any human intervention. Trojan horse appears to be one type of software and is unexpectedly something totally different. Trapdoors or backdoors. These are situations in which the software is working exactly as intended, but it has a little trapdoor in there. So if someone says Mexico cow or something, it suddenly changes behavior. Trapdoors happen a lot in AI. There's a whole branch of study trying to identify whether or not you can create trapdoors without even being the AI company by just producing a lot of data on the internet and forcing them to exist. A rabbit is a malicious program that exhausts system resources. So we talk about how confidentiality, integrity, availability. This one hits availability. If I can burn away the battery power on your phone, I can cause a lot of availability damage. If I can use up all the ink in your printer, I can cause a lot of availability damage. Rabbits do this. They try to just eat the system apart. Spyware steals information. Spyware can be any of the above, but it's specific about it is that it steals information. It's most commonly known for stealing keystrokes. And then I've added supply chain this year, and I don't know if I have an example of it in the slide deck, but this is becoming a major issue. This is a situation where I have a program here. It calls a library. The library is infected. So we're having a lot of cases in which somebody is trying to attack the supply chain. And now you have to worry about your entire supply chain in your code, not just your own security. Especially if you're doing one of these mix of like the cool, awesome, and really stupid moves of downloading all the libraries fresh every single morning and hitting run, and then like you're like bleeding edge new stuff, and that also means you get the bleeding edge new viruses. All right, one of the oldest known viruses is something called the brain virus. This was a bit of, I think it's heart. Yeah, this is back when we used to use floppy drives. You probably don't remember this, but I, as a kid, you get a computer that could not run by itself. You'd have to put a floppy drive in, and the entire operating system was sitting on the floppy drive. You would get games that had an operating system in them because that's how you turned on the computer. So what this thing did is it replaced the floppy drive boot sector with itself, installed copies in everywhere it could pull off, and it infected that boot record in the floppy drive. What broadly happened is I think these were heart. There was a machine that was used in medicine, and people kept stealing the software for the machine. So the attackers in this case are the original authors of that software, and they did the equivalent of just sending out fake versions that were free or onto these servers so that you download them and they'd have the virus on it. And then it just basically said, pay for our stuff, stop mucking with this. This actually didn't cause any harm, really, and it only really impacted medical devices of this type. But this is one of the oldest. This dates back to 1986. We have had viruses since 1986. Much more famous is the Morris worm. This took down the whole internet badly. This was written as a curiosity, but had a flaw, according to its author. We never actually can know what really caused them to write this, but they wrote it. They did not mean for it to be so bad. It really was. It was designed to determine where it could spread the infection whenever possible, and remain undiscovered. It really messed up on 3. Exploited several vulnerabilities, so it did password guessing. Back in 1988, we were not using good passwords at all. We were using a lot of default passwords. It also found a hole in the debug mode of using Xsendmail. There was a patch available at the time. And it used a buffer overflow hole in something called Fingered, which you may never have run into, but was used a lot at the time. It was used even when I was in undergrad. This was 99 lines of C code. So it just sent 99 lines of C code to the victim, which then downloaded the rest via the internet. What took down the internet, though, is that this was unintentionally a rabbit. In theory, it's trying to not be discovered. So it self-deleted itself if anything went wrong. So if you interrupted transmission, if the whole thing didn't come across, it would self-delete. The code was actually encrypted, which is pretty rare at the time. The downloaded code also deleted after compilation, so it self-compile itself and then delete the original code to make it harder to find itself. And it would periodically change its process ID. It's actually kind of weird to do. And it was supposed to periodically check if the system was already infected. This is what got mucked up. So what happened is that once it got infected, it would just reinfect itself and reinfect itself and reinfect itself. And by the time you were done, it would just flatten the system. And this is the definition of a rabbit. So this is an example of a virus, a worm. A Morris worm is a worm. It self-propagates. It scans IP addresses. If it spots something that can infect it, infects it directly. It does not need a human intervention. It is also an example, unintentionally, of a rabbit in that it just overloads all the memory on the computer. It just keeps reinstalling itself and eventually eats all the resources and flattens the computer. This is mostly a very important one. By the way, this is one of the original floppy disks in the museum of the Morse worm. The internet was originally pitched to the US government as a way to maintain communication, even in the case of a nuclear attack. Because at the time, we were really worried about that in the US. We were having this standoff issue with Russia. And so a lot of military funding went into creating a secondary communication system. You don't necessarily think of the internet that way, but that's how it was originally funded. It was a big issue that somebody with 99 lines of C code and no access could take the entire internet down. It's a big problem. And so it caused a lot of, also, it's notable that more damage was caused by people panicking and unplugging their computers than was ever actually caused by this worm. Note that none of that actually caused an attack anywhere other than it being a rabbit. In fact, I think some versions of the Morse worm also patched the system for you. So it would get in through the thing and then it would patch the system. So this led to something called the Computer Emergency Response Teams. So the one at Carnegie Mellon University, for example, was created off of this. You'll now find certs worldwide. They operate in very different ways in different countries, but they're specifically in charge of handling emergencies like this and giving advice to companies. Then we had Code Red. Code Red is also a worm. Worms are bad, by the way. Worms are now rare, but they are really bad. This infected 300,000 computers in 14 hours. Wow, is that slow in modern day? But that was really fast at the time. It exploited a buffer overflow in Microsoft software. Then it monitored all the traffic on port 80 looking for more victims. So if you tried to access this infected server, it would say, that looks like a victim. And it would send another message back to them and try to attack them. And this is how it's a worm, because it infects one system and it monitors for other ones and it directly impacts them. Another way of saying a worm is it's possible to infect a system without human intervention. This was notable just because of how fast it spread. It also had this little if statement in it where it would do different things depending on the date. It was obviously intended to take out whitehouse.gov, for example. This is also a nice case study in updates. So as soon as Code Red hit, Microsoft panicked and pushed out an update. It had a horrendous bug in it that horrendously destroyed everything. So they panically pushed out a second update, which contained a smaller but less problematic error. Everyone installed that. And then the third patch finally installed fixed that small error. It's 3 patches now. And almost no one installed the third patch because the second one looked like it was kind of working. I've seen research papers on this. All right, 2003, SQL Slammer worm. We have not hit SQL injections yet, but they are a common way to attack systems. SQL is a database language, for anyone who doesn't know. SQL injection is a way you can write something into the database language that will cause you to read basically files inside the database when you should not be able to do so. We will talk about how you do that later. This one infected 75,000 systems in 10 minutes. We're speeding up. And peak infections doubled every 8.5 seconds. That means that basically one thing is infected, then it affects everything else, right? So as you have more infected systems, the speed at which you're infecting things goes up until we hit a natural ceiling. And you're seeing a pattern here with worms, right? Each infected system generated random IP addresses and tried to infect them. This one was interesting, though, because it used UDP packets. So we talked about TCP. In TCP, I create a connection between me and the party, and we have to do a whole handshake. In UDP, I just send a singular packet, and there is no connection. They fit the entire attack into one UDP packet. So as you may have been noticing if you've been playing the firewall games allow you to, or you can create something that's intended to run a session. A lot of firewalls at the time were designed to look for sessions because they assumed you couldn't get that much attack code into such a small package. You would have to have a session first. And so it usually accepted UDP packets, but it would kill TCP session code. No one thought you could do this in 376 bytes. You can do this in 376 bytes. And that's, oh my stomachs. We are now getting more modern. I have talked to people who tell me whole wind farms are still infected with Stuxnet. This is also the first virus on our list. This is not a worm. Or at least it's definitely not self-propagating like the other ones. Okay. I'm going to explain this as an American citizen and try to be careful. The U.S. government did not like that Iran has nuclear weapons. You may have noticed this behavior of late. We also didn't have this opinion back in 2005. We didn't like the fact that they were developing anything nuclear. Now, we could take the route we're taking right now, or the other solution is Iran is not that rich of a country. What if we just took the most expensive component in a nuclear reactor and make sure it fails a lot? So what Stuxnet does is find the most expensive component in the entire nuclear reactor and just cause it to fail a whole lot, which is kind of like just slamming the brakes on their entire program. So the way they did this, and again, I am describing this as an unofficial, no one has ever come forward to explain this properly to anyone, is this is an air-gapped system. Iran's not idiots. They know that maybe you shouldn't connect nuclear reactors to the internet. And so they had what's called an air gap. That means this system has no wires at all to the external system. This is the best way we know to do security. Anything that can hop an air gap immediately gets a lot of attention because it's bad. I have seen discussions of whether or not you can do this via speakers, for example. So how did the US government hop the air gap? Well, they took a bunch of infected USB drives and spread them in the parking lot. And then a contractor picked them up and put one in his laptop and then walked across the air gap and plugged his laptop into the Iranian system. Similar to how Morris was intended, this is really trying to not be found, because if it's found, we have a big problem. So originally, they did exactly as I kind of described. It used 4 unpatched Windows vulnerabilities to pull this off. The US government also tested this on their own nuclear reactors locally to make sure it would actually function first. And then they found that it just wasn't causing enough damage, so they issued a second version using the same delivery mechanism. And that second version was a lot more aggressive in how it tried to attack things and got half the planet infected with Stuxnet. Stuxnet is not really hostile to most computers unless you happen to be a nuclear facility. But this is a very famous one because of the sheer amount of damage this did to Iran. Not Petra. Oh my. Yeah, not Petra. I mentioned supply chains. This is a combination of a supply chain attack and also a worm. It's a combination of these two. But it is the worms I've been talking about up till now, they scan for IP addresses. That means the attack is coming in over the open internet. By 2017, we're generally speaking pretty good at running firewalls. And so it is really hard actually to attack a company across the open internet. It's still possible, but it is harder. So we are seeing a massive shift over into this idea of supply chains. So there's this small Ukrainian company back in 2017 that makes tax software. This sounds completely uninteresting. But we now know through hard experience that a shocking percentage of the world runs this tax software. Presumably the Russians, and this is allegedly the Russians, attacked this small company, modified their tax software code, and pushed an automatic update. You may have noticed that your computers automatically install updates now. We have decided as a security community that automatic updating is generally, statistically speaking, safer across the whole population than not doing that. But this is one negative side effect, because if the attacker can get access to the system, they can automatically push that terrible software out to the whole world automatically and bypass firewalls, bypass antivirus, bypass access control, because they have access to all of that already. This update was installed worldwide. It made use of something called Eternal Blue, which is developed by the US and then leaked as part of one of their many breaches. And it's designed to spread as a worm. and it pretended to be ransomware, but was likely actually political. So when it locked systems down, it locked them down and said, oh, I'm ransomware, pay for this here. I don't actually remember if you paid, if it actually unlocked anything or if they had a bug in their code, but I don't remember anyone getting it back via ransom. The key here, though, is that that automatic update pushed that attack inside the network. So that attack started from inside of a local area network as opposed to starting on the internet. Remember, I talk about castle security a lot? This is a downside because now that attack is happening to computers that were theoretically already protected by a firewall, and there was no internal firewall protecting them. Maybe I don't have it on this deck, but there is an amazing article, possibly by Wired actually, of how this thing took down Maersk. There's a global shipping company, and you've probably seen their name on the side of a lot of shipping containers in your lifespan. They ship globally, worldwide. They were taken down by this hard. They lost global shipping worldwide. And there's this awesome whole story of kind of how they tried to put themselves back together, but it turned out they had backups, but not for a couple of vitally important things. And the end result was that at some point just before this hit, a lightning strike had hit one of their data centers down in South America somewhere and taken it offline. So it wasn't actually impacted by NotPetya. And they ended up taking a hard drive from that center, and they couldn't get enough visa access for any one employee that they had to literally take this hard drive via airplane, pass it off to a different employee in the middle of an airport, and fly it all the way back up to center to rebuild their entire system. Backups are important. And worms and viruses hit backups.
Is it possible to trace it back?
Sorry?
Is it possible to trace it back to the original attacker? Are they ever held responsible for it?
We can't trace this so easily because the problem is they broke into this small Ukrainian company. So we know the origin was a small Ukrainian company. This is no doubt. We know exactly what tax software was hit. But when it comes to attack, it's really hard to go back. And attribution is especially hard because if you think back to what I was talking about in networking, where I talk about spoofing, the first thing you do as an attacker is you break into some small victim, and then you attack from that victim's position. So maybe you can figure out who that victim is, but they're a victim too. This group also makes use of things like Tor. And as we learned, it's really hard to trace back the origin point for Tor. However, you may be aware that there is tension between Russia and the Ukraine, and there was tension back in 2017. And generally speaking, most of Ukraine's infrastructure has been hammered, suspiciously more than the rest of the world. And so we attribute most Ukrainian-based attacks to Russia. Trojans. Trojans are designed to look like normal software, but are not. I don't remember that. I was spending this morning on Spectre, let's put it that way. I didn't review all these slides as much as I normally would. This is a simple example of a Trojan, because a Trojan can take a bit of a mental understanding. Imagine you download this thing called freemusic.mp3. How many of you actually have seen file extensions recently very much, unless you're using Linux? If you're using Linux, you've seen the file extensions, but unless you've gone into the subcomponent of Mac and Windows and told them to show you file extensions, they're hidden. So this thing comes down. Often when things come down, they can also pick their own icon. How much access control is sitting behind that icon? 0. How much access control is sitting behind that file extension? Nothing. The only thing the file extension does automatic access control on is the real file extension, which is not pictured here, is what your operating system uses to trigger the system that will automatically open it. Past that, it's not.
I was going to say on Mac, if you're doing it not through terminal, but manually, and you're changing the file extension, it will double check and say, there is a warning screen.
If you're changing it, but what if the attacker changes?
That's what I'm saying, it's not through terminal. They're some type of thing, I think that's more for the user being protected from the user.
Weird file extensions will cause errors. I'm keeping this in theory land here for a moment, but yes, especially. So imagine your expected behavior here is that iTunes is going to open it, but actually iTunes opens and plays weird laughter and then pops up and disappears. So it's not necessarily the case that freemusic.mp3. It could actually have been an exe program. It could have been targeting that specifically. So things like icons and file extensions are mostly for people. Access control is only linked to them in that the automated what's going to be first picked to go and run that file is linked to that extension. It's quite possible you have freemusic.mp3.exe, and that is often hidden from people. So this is a very trivial example of a Trojan. Trojans can also target vulnerabilities. So maybe you think, oh yeah, I'm going to go and start iTunes. Does anyone know what, oh, goodness, sorry, this is maybe out of date, so I might be wrong now, but for a long time, iTunes is running basically web pages inside of it. A lot of things run web pages inside of it. Have you noticed that? Like this is the web browser, but suspiciously, this is web content. Do you think it's just copying the web browser? How is it getting that web content? Well, often it has taken an engine from one of the big web browsers, WebKit being a common one. So iTunes runs WebKit. Safari runs WebKit. We find that a lot of people understand that viruses come from the internet, so they will update their browser. Do you have the same opinion for iTunes? What you're seeing on the screen here is now a bit of an old research paper, but it found that it's shocking the number of different versions of the same piece of software you have in your computer. So you may think, oh, I have up-to-date Safari, but actually you're running 6 versions of WebKit, which is the engine sitting underneath this. Trojans will sometimes take advantage of this. Viruses will sometimes take advantage of this. So they might mark themselves as an MP3 file and specifically target an issue that it knows exists in iTunes, even if it's patched somewhere else. This means keeping computers up to date really, really hard. And allows your attack surface is basically enormous because of this. All right, we're basically out of time, so I'm going to I think I kind of answered this actually accidentally. Trojans are also really common in phishing. So you've probably seen, I don't know if this is the latest UI, but this bar at the top of Microsoft Office files a whole lot, and you're like, what's this doing here? This is just so annoying. How come I can't just edit this thing? This is here to try to protect you against Trojans because Microsoft Word and etc. are very complicated programs. And they can do a lot of stuff, and they probably have a lot of viruses in them. And so what's happened is when you initially start it, it starts with a massive subset of its features. It doesn't allow macros. It doesn't allow a whole bunch of things that we know are commonly attack vectors. It just locks all of them down unless you actually need any of those. And that's what that box is doing. Okay, the last part's my view. This is blame the user security. It should never be the case that I open up a Word document and my entire computer becomes compromised. I mean, like, what the heck? Instead, we blame the user and make them click more buttons because we can't get the security right. Soapbox. Trojans were a common thing in peer-to-peer file sharing. Because one of the ways we do verification of systems and whether this is correct or not is you go to the verified web page of the company and pull the file down from them. And we really hope we're not experiencing a man-in-the-middle attack, and we have a lot of stuff like TLS that's intended to protect us there. But sometimes you'd like a free version of that program. And so you go to a peer-to-peer file sharing, or you go to a bit more iffy site on the internet, and they're like, oh, if you download this exe, you can totally have that game for free. And so what do? You click the exe thing, you download it, and you can get all sorts of interesting stuff on here. The news article here is kind of funny. So Korean telecom allegedly infected P2P users with malware. So what they did was I have to remember if this is a man-in-the-middle attack. Oh yeah, no. Okay, I don't remember how they did the delivery, but what they did was they basically put bad files up on these file sharing systems, specifically aimed at their own customers. If you downloaded this file and ran it, it would go and purposely attack the system that's using that file and take you offline. Let's see. Yeah, so then there's an injection attack. I just remember that. All right, sorry. I spent this morning on Spectre and was not reading this properly. Oh, I thought about this problem. They were attacking web hard drives. And so they would actually inject this information in. They would attack it with malware, and then they got caught with this, and their official opinion after getting caught was that since web hard drive P2P service is itself a malicious program, it had no choice to control it but to attack their own customers. Yeah. Wow. Korea is a really fascinating place. They're just so different culturally in many ways. This one's also fun. A Disney employee lost a phenomenal amount of Disney data just because they decided to download a fun AI that kind of fiddled with images. That's it. That's all they did. They were on their personal home computer. Their daughter had some image, and they were like, let's download this fun-looking program that's supposed to take AI and, I don't know, put mouse ears on you or something. Downloaded that, ran it once. It didn't really do what they expected it to do, so they deleted it, and Disney lost a huge amount of data because this was a Trojan. What it did is it broke into his 1Password account. 1Password is a password manager. It included some of his Disney employee passwords because work from home is a thing. The attacker then took more than a terabyte from internal Disney Slack and published it online. Trojan. Worms are still a thing. This one's replicating through NPM. So the way this works, actually, sorry, I'm going to have to read from the slide for this one. This one I added this year. When a developer installs a compromised package, the malware will look for an NPM token in the environment. So if you download this package, it just scans your environment for one of these tokens. You probably have one if you're an NPM user, and if you're not a developer, you probably don't have one. So it just self-deletes. If it finds it, it will modify the 20 most popular packages the NPM token has access to, copying itself into the package and publishing a new version automatically. And this was originally seeded, because you had to affect the first developer, didn't you? With a phishing attack, a scam message, basically, getting you to install really anything. And then that started this attack. This is an interesting worm attack because, again, the earlier worms attacks I showed you were all across networks, weren't they? This is 100% supply chain. So what you're doing is you're seeding it into one library, assuming developers will install it proactively in their libraries. But because of automation, this becomes a worm. If you were hitting automatic download, if you were manually downloading each of these libraries, I would call this a virus. But because of the way we automate things nowadays, it is a worm. All right, all that is bad stuff. How do we find it? So sometimes we find things, so things like fuzz testing are meant to test your own code or a singular program. But most of you have probably heard of an antivirus. You may even be running one. I hope you are running one. Or if you're running Linux, okay, things get complicated. Windows ships with an antivirus now, which says a lot about their opinion of their own software. One of the earliest and most common ways of doing this is something called signatures. This is being blown to shreds with AI. But the idea here is that an attack will have a common pattern to it. And so you just look for that pattern. We look for it in memory. You look for it in newly installed stuff. For example, that code might always call out to the same server to get its secondary package, for example. So if you look for that URL, you can go, okay, nothing else should be accessing this. This is bad. We find these commonalities. These things are often shared. So, for example, the W32 Beast virus always contained this code in it. We're just looking for this. It's called signature detection. Sometimes we also look for change detection. So maybe when that antivirus is first installed in your system, it takes a look at the whole system. And then it goes, what has changed? Has a bit of this system changed that I didn't expect to change? And then goes and looks for that. So this is the Heartland payment systems. Heartland was amazing, by the way. Heartland, so the whole concept of change detection is malware code has to be somewhere. This is why, I forget which government recently recommended that you restart your cell phone every week. Why does it recommend this? Because viruses often live in RAM. They just refresh themselves so they're never moved out of RAM. And if the antivirus system is looking in the hard drive, you're not going to find it. But if you restart your cell phone, it actually flushes a shocking number of viruses out of your system. But most people don't restart their cell phones very often, and so it persists. Normally, you scan things like RAM and the hard drive looking for things that might be a bit off. In Heartland, they actually went and took the attack code and put it in unallocated memory. Why don't you put things in unallocated memory? Why is putting things in unallocated memory a bad idea? Yeah, it might just get overwritten. But there's a shocking amount of unallocated memory. So you can actually copy yourself into 20 different unallocated memory positions to just keep you moving it around. So when they did the analysis of Heartland payment systems, which was a huge attack that lost a shocking percentage of US credit card numbers, they found that actually the attack code was in unallocated memory. And most people weren't looking in unallocated memory because why would you put anything there? They did. Looking for anomalies, though, is very error-prone. A signature is usually dead on. It's very rare that a signature will fail. You find something that turns out to be something else. The big exception to that is antivirus systems. So it used to be the case you should never install two antiviruses together or they'll tear each other apart because they'll find the bad signatures in the other antivirus and just start deleting each other's files. I think we fixed that now, but it used to be a big problem. But normally a signature will only match a bad thing. And if it's only matching a bad thing, it's highly accurate. But things like anomaly detection are not highly accurate. A lot of things change for many reasons, and so tracking this down can be very problematic. This, however, has got good promise with AI. So these are things like intrusion detection systems, file access patterns, process creation patterns. If you have a security team in a company, this is usually where they're sitting. They've got automation on the firewall already. They've got some stuff on the known stuff. What they're usually looking into is things like weird patterns. This weird thing has just popped up. This is also a really natural match for machine learning. What does weird look like anyway? Wow, well, let's build a statistical model of what normal looks like, and then we'll try to determine whether or not the thing we're looking at now is or is not matching to that statistical model. And I have just described machine learning. So machine learning is used extensively in these spaces, both to map what's normal and then also to figure out what might be abnormal. The Target data breach is a good example of this. So just before Christmas in 2013, which is a terrible time to have this happen, their payment systems were all breached. So their point of sale terminals where you slide your credit card, those were compromised. This was announced on the radios right before Christmas. Target was not pleased. This resulted in, so the way they got in was an HVAC provider. So if you look up, there's all these things in the ceiling which are dropping air into this room so that none of us suffocate. That's the HVAC. What happened was everything is getting smart nowadays. So is the HVAC. So the HVAC needed access to Target's networks to be able to go and do remote monitoring of the HVAC system. Target let them be in there, and we had a supply chain attack. Someone attacked the HVAC provider. The HVAC provider then got access to internal networks for Target stores across the country. Was then able to access the payment terminals. Man, someone should have installed a firewall. But the key point is actually point 3. So after all of that mess happens, what happens after a breach like this? Well, usually what happens after a breach like this is we reset everyone's passwords, but we can't reset passwords because it's credit cards. So instead, they have to reissue credit cards. Whenever you have to reissue something physical and pay for postage, and you have to do this for 30 million Americans, the number for this gets a little high. Also, in the United States, if you lose someone's data like this, you have to pay for 2 years of credit monitoring is the new standard. So as soon as the insurance company got through with paying for all of that, they turned around and sued Target and basically said, okay, our clause in our insurance contract says that you have to not be aware of the breach. This is very common language in legal cases in which they basically say, we will pay for damages if this is an unknown breach. So everyone started pulling the logs. And in the logs, it had multiple automated warnings from their anti-intrusion software about a malicious installation. It had multiple automated warnings about large amounts of data being taken off the system. Neither of these were identified by the system administrators. Did they know if they never looked at the logs enough? One side effect of this is we are seeing a lot of changes in logging and willingness to turn on logs because logs themselves are now seen as a liability. Because did you know if it was in the logs and you never looked? It's a legal issue. Yeah, this is just a high-level comment. Areas like aviation, so airplanes, have what we call a no-fault view. This means, so Boeing, when I took this screenshot, was having a lot of trouble with their airplanes. This is an ongoing problem. Generally, if you make a mistake in aeronautics and an airplane crashes, you are not, I'm being very vague here, but generally not liable as much. Now, if you do this multiple times in a row, that might change, but they take a no-fault view. They would rather have you be open and honest and tear that airplane to shreds and have the entire community learn what not to do than they would go after that airline. That is not how we work in security. In security, if you have a breach, we kill you. We launch lawyers at you. We make you reset all the credit cards. And this causes us to do things like turn off logging so that we don't know. You know who the first person gets called after a data breach? It's not the security test team or any of that. It's the lawyers. Lawyers now decide what firm is going to go through and figure out who done it. And that's based a lot on whether or not they have used that firm before and found that they're good at not keeping logs. All right. Apparently Wednesday's lecture last year stopped here, so we might as well stop here this year. I think what's sitting after here is... Oh, things like salami attacks. Okay, never mind. We're close enough to the end. I'll just explain salami attacks and then end up there. This is reference to Superman 3. So a salami attack is an attack that takes only a small amount of the resource each time to avoid being noticed. This is a famous reference from Superman 3 where they decide to take all half pennies at the bank and just move all the half cents into an account. So instead of rounding up, we take those fractions of a cent, but then it explodes into a large amount of money. This is used sometimes to kind of siphon resources out the side. This is basically fraud because you're stealing small amounts, but you're trying to steal it really small. All right, and I will end there. On Friday, we'll do a better job of having think pair shares mixed in. All right, see you all on Friday.
Oh my God. That's like